My name is Amy Anderson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumnae Relations. Before we begin today's session, please note that there will be time for questions towards the end of the presentation. So if you have anything to ask Brandyn, Amanda, and Anna, please just click the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that you may need to exit out of the full screen view in order to see the Ask a Question button. This session will be recorded and posted on our Alum Learning Consortium's past event recordings page in approximately 5 business days. Now, please welcome our moderator for today's session, Cathy Hansen, Vice President of Institutional Advancement.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome and thank you to all of you for taking your time this evening to join us for a very important and timely conversation. We're pleased to welcome 3 guests tonight. Anna Mercedes, Associate Professor and Chair of the St. Ben's St. John's Theology Department. Brandyn Woodard, who is the Director of our Intercultural and International Student Services, and Amanda Jantzer, Assistant Professor of Psychology. The 3 of them are the co-leaders of the Becoming Community initiative on our campuses, and we're thrilled that they would join us this evening. This is the 5th in our series, and we hope that it will challenge you tonight, that it will inspire you and educate you. I will start off with a series of questions for our 3 guests, and then we will turn it over to you at the end of the hour for your questions. So we've got a lot to cover tonight, so let's get started. These past 2+ weeks have really made clear that we have much work to do to both, I would say, atone for and also correct generations of racial oppression. George Floyd's murder and the subsequent protests have made very clear that, that we are being spurred out of maybe a complacency that some of us had been in, and that's a good thing. We have work that we need to do as individuals, as a college, as a state, and as a community. Now, the 3 of you are leaders, as I mentioned, of St. Ben's Becoming Community initiative, which is a major effort on our campuses to create transformative inclusion. So I'd love to hear from you about a little bit more about the initiative, what prompted it to be, and what are some of the goals of the initiative?
I think I can jump in. Thank you so much, Cathy, for having us. Thank you for inviting us to talk about this work at this particular moment. Mm-hmm. Becoming community, it's sort of in the name. I think anybody who is joining us tonight knows that at St. Ben's and St. John's, we talk a lot about community, and for good reason. But becoming community challenges us to think in different ways about community. So Becoming Community started as a grant, a $600,000 grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We're in the 3rd year of the grant, but I think my colleagues will agree that it has become more than just a grant. This initiative began spearheaded by President Mary Hinton, with this idea that community is something that we're perpetually becoming, and that community is something we create together, that we need to recreate together, that we co-create, and really at the heart of it is something you'll probably hear us talk a lot about tonight. At the heart of it is something called transformative inclusion. And we're going to talk about this tonight, I think, because I think there's something about transformative inclusion that can help us right now.
So Anna or Brandyn, what do we mean when we say transformative inclusion? What's that all about?
I'll be happy to jump in. I'm Anna. So when we say transformative inclusion, we mean a sort of inclusion that welcomes total ground up, from the center out, from the outside in transformation. This is different than what Mary Hinton our outgoing president, has called additive inclusion. With an additive inclusion, you have the sort of inclusion that makes inclusion a bad word. There's a lot of people who would say we need to not be doing inclusion work anymore. And I agree with them, especially if what we mean is add other people to whatever our us is right now. Don't change the us, just let more people be like us. I would agree. I don't want to be about that kind of work either. And especially in the last few weeks, I've seen some of those critiques on the internet, like we need to move on from inclusion. And often I think, well, that's what they mean when I read what they're saying. We need instead an overhaul of what a norm looks like, what center looks like. And so that's what our phrase transformative inclusion means, that we are open to transformation.
So
now,
go ahead, Anna.
I was just thinking, I anticipate that you might, that those listening, that you, Cathy, might want us to talk about some of the specific programs.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So there have been 3 sort of prongs that have developed as the main offerings of the Becoming Community grant. Now we're in a time of reimagining who will be in this new time of pandemic. But before that began, we had 3 major aims. And what I want to highlight for those listening is that each of these was an invitation to those who participated to show us what inclusion would look like. None of these were Amanda and Brandyn and I saying, here's what you're going to do to make it transformative around here, because we didn't know. They had to come on board and show us. And some of you out there listening are a part of these initiatives. Alums have been with us. And these 3 major pieces are these. We have a professional development workshop series, and people can come to as many of the events as they wish, but if they would like, they can keep track and become a practitioner. They can be recognized as a practitioner of transformative inclusion, and even an advanced practitioner. That's been an exciting piece, and that has involved local voices. It's involved lifting up people who are already on campus or in the local community with so much to teach about what inclusion could be. That's the certificate series. Then we also have the Mellon Inclusion Research Projects. These are seed grants or mini grants where we take the money that we receive from the Mellon Foundation and break them down to be mini grants for research teams, faculty, staff, and students together, looking at a specific area.
Can you give us a few examples? Some of those projects have been so interesting and I think really important. Just, describe a couple of them.
But Amanda's always the one who takes that question. So it's all Amanda.
Okay.
There is just so much to be proud of. People are doing such amazing work. So for instance, there are projects that are really aimed at systemic change, like looking at cross-cutting issues across the institutions, like lack of food security and lack of transportation accessibility. And then other people looked at particular marginalized populations, like our Native students, our heritage speakers, our Spanish heritage speakers. And then other people looked particularly within departments. But so these began as little research projects. Mm-hmm. You pose a research question, you gather some information. And then I constantly feel like I'm seeing the best of us, because then students and faculty and staff took that research, they took the stories they were hearing from people who've been too marginalized, and they have enacted change. They have, Ted Gordon with his Native Studies work has literally created new relationships with sovereign nations and brought people to campus, and really is been engaging in restorative justice. It's stuff we can really be proud of.
Well, in fact, Ted Gordon and I are working on a project that is having to be delayed because of the pandemic, but it's really about kind of interrogating our role in the boarding schools, the Native American boarding schools that, the monastery, was all a part of. And so we're working with Native communities to understand that better. It's just an example of how this has a ripple effect, I think, into the broader community. Brandyn, I'd love to hear from you. When this grant is over, what do you hope you see? What do you hope you see and what do you think you'll see? Those are maybe two different questions.
So the third prong that Anna was going to get to is the dialogue groups, which Anna did a fantastic job organizing. Mm-hmm. And what I'm hoping is that those folks who are part of the dialogue groups right now continue to do the personal, the communal, and the institutional work that helps us continue moving forward. Because of my experience in the Peace Corps years ago, there's a philosophy that I'm hanging on to, which is work yourself out of a job. Have so much support for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and belongingness, and transformative inclusion, that there'll be so many people who are doing it, that when you come to St. Ben's, you'll feel it, you'll be able to embrace it, and you'll know exactly what's expected of you if you're going to be a part of our community.
Are you seeing any signs or feeling any signs of difference now from when you started?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've noticed personally that people are now speaking up more. They're raising issues about sexuality, about religion, about ability in spaces and in places and ways that they hadn't before. That's exciting, because in essence, what we're seeing is that people have agency. They have their voices. They're using their voices to really speak the truth and bring a new perspective into our community that has been sometimes lacking.
The projects that you are all describing, that's a part of the Becoming Community initiative, I mean, I think I'm not overstating it to say literally hundreds of faculty and staff and students have been involved in one or more of the dialogue groups or the research projects or the workshops that you're hosting. Is that right? I mean, how many people are we reaching?
Well, I mean, in the dialogue groups alone, we had set out with the goal of having 200 people involved. And because that was an ambitious goal, Brandyn was coaching me in the months building up to it. You know, Anna, you are doing a great job, even if we have 100 people. So I was all going to be good with that. And then we got 312 people signed up.
Fantastic.
Yes, it was incredible. But what that shows you is that this is a community hungry for transformation, and that people were willing to invest serious time and emotional vulnerability into doing it. And that's just the dialogue groups. I mean, that was one of the 3 prongs. It's been amazing. It's been really very motivational. And when the pandemic started, it gave me great hope, because we already had this sort of basket weave of stronger community because of the work this grant had been doing. So it made me feel like we could go distant with more confidence.
That's an interesting point of view. We'll come back to that later on, kind of the relationship between this work and the pandemic. And I want to stick with you, Anna. I've heard you talk before about how our Benedictine values, in fact, require us to do the work of ending racial oppression and really bringing about transformative inclusion. So say more about what you mean when you say that.
Yes, I'm glad to do that. It's a helpful exercise, I think, for anyone who wants to reflect on the Benedictine values, to go through each of them. You can, you know, if you've gotten rusty, if you're an alum who's been away for a while, you can always find them on the website. But you know, you can go through each one, and I think you would draw the connecting lines yourself between the work of racial justice, the work of human dignity, and all of these values. But what I want to say to you now in just a brief form is that the easiest things to cite would, of course, be the dignity of all people, respect for persons, and justice work. I mean, that you barely even have to stretch to see that connection. So I'm just going to trust that maybe you already see that connection. And as a Lutheran pastor on our theology department, I want to instead stress the one that maybe isn't quite as obvious right at first, but to me is the core. And that's that awareness of God and hospitality are so central to what it means to be a person in a Benedictine path. And those really, for me, are the ones that make us, as anyone trying to live in a Benedictine way, stand up for everyone's right to breathe. What we mean when we say awareness of God is something very much like what the Quaker tradition means. That is that the light within each person, that God is a spirit within each person. So if we are trapping the breath out of any one person, we are doing that to God's own neck. And when the Benedictines say we will be hospitable, they don't mean come on and stay over. They mean Christ may be showing up at the door at any moment. And so we must keep our door open.
Welcoming anyone as Christ among us, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So for me, that's the root of it. We have to protect the breath of all people as the breath of the Holy Spirit in the world.
Are the sisters involved in the work of Becoming Community?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the sisters are in the dialogue groups.
Okay.
The sisters come to the workshops. Yes, absolutely. They are there and they are involved.
I want to take this minute actually to ask those of you who are listening to use the Ask a Question button. Just hit that button. And we would love for as many of you as possible to submit your answer to this question. What would St. Ben's look like, feel like, act like if we were truly as diverse, equitable, and inclusive as our Benedictine values call us to be? So what would we look like, feel like, act like if we were really living these Benedictine values? If you can share your answers via the Ask a Question button, we're going to collect all of those answers and we'll be sharing them with the Becoming Community leadership team, as well as with the St. Ben's Alumnae Board, who's having conversation and doing work around these issues as well. So we'd really welcome, submit at any time during the rest of the program while we're continuing on with our questions. So so most of us, I got to be candid, most of us listening to this program tonight are white. They're white people. And I believe white people of goodwill. And we know that white people need to own the work that we need to be doing, right, in order to bring about true transformative inclusion and to eliminate racial oppression. So I'm particularly interested in what you, Amanda and Anna, have to say about the work that white folks need to be doing. What would you say to that?
I think you're right. You hear people say this, you need to do the work. So what is the work? So when I think about that, I'm coming from my field in psychology. And in psychology, we like models. There's a tripartite model that I think really makes sense. I am a psychologist through and through. So it begins with doing your own work, really trying to raise your own awareness. As people with majority identities, like white folks like us, we might not know what we don't know. Right? We have lots of blind spots that are granted to us by our privilege, by our roles in a white supremacist society. So we need to read, we need to reflect, we need to raise our own awareness. But that we can't stop there. We need to do that work. It's not easy work, it's lifelong work. But we also need to, the second prong, is we need to live in connection with other people. We need to connect with people who do not share our worldview and our assumptions and our social identities. We need to build and cultivate empathy. We need to center people who have been marginalized and then amplify their voices. Okay. And so that's the last piece. That leads to, then we got to do something about it. But the piece about connection is important, because if we take action as white folks because we think we are do-gooders and we think we know best and we think we can save somebody, then we are likely to do harm. We must base our action in relationships. We need to take the lead from people in the communities that we want to serve. Connection is necessary for true action to really be effective.
That's really helpful. I like your notion of amplifying others' voices, and that's something I think many of us are trying to be attentive to on social media, right? People don't need to hear from me, about what's going on in the world. There are other people whose lived experiences at the center of what's happening, and those voices need to be amplified. That's very important. Anna, what would you say the work is for white folks?
I'll just add one thing, and that's that white folks need to mess up sometimes. That is, so much of the work of white supremacy is keeping up the facade of being in control, having the answers, and being polished. I'm putting polished in air quotes. So to take up the work of deconstructing white privilege, you have to be willing to deconstruct your own white polish. And this can mean totally having no clue what to say sometimes. It can mean showing somebody that you're actually physically shaking because you're afraid. It can mean letting a tear come out your eye instead of repressing it as you may have been taught to do. All sorts of vulnerability, because you've just decided that your own image in the world and keeping it the pristine way that you were perhaps raised to keep it as a white person is not nearly as important as somebody else's breath. So you just have to be willing to mess up and tell your kids, your sister, your neighbor, your staff that you don't know what to say, and that you might have just made a really big mistake. And you just start getting comfortable with being really uncomfortable, and you ask for forgiveness a lot and
genuinely apologize, right?
Yeah. And just really not have the agenda. You just don't have it anymore, which is really scary for me sometimes, but it's part of it.
Brandyn, you work with so many students in your role as Director of Intercultural and National Student Services. And I'm wondering how you see this dynamic playing out among and between students.
I think you're right, Cathy. We do have a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned folks. My very succinct answer to the question of what white folks need to do: destroy the system that perpetuate systemic oppression. It was built by you. It was built to benefit you. Now that you have this awareness, this understanding, now it's time to destroy it. And in collaboration with, not in front of, but in collaboration with not only people of color, but trans folks, folks who are not Christian, people who have disabilities, et cetera. We need to build something new that includes everyone. Kimberly Jones has a wonderful, actually, David Jones recorded Kimberly Jones on YouTube saying some really powerful and raw, so be forewarned, things. And one of them was, she used the analogy of playing Monopoly for 400 years, but not actually being able to own property, to go around the board, et cetera. And in conversation with some colleagues earlier today, I said, we need a new game. We need to create a new game that's not like Monopoly, where we have more folks who are part of the development of the game or the system. We have more folks who are able to participate in the game or the system. And I said, we should change the goal of the game, because right now the goal of the system is to become as rich as possible, or to be the most powerful, or to have all the control. I am thinking that if we get to a point where we are able to build something new, that perhaps the goal of the game, instead of winning, perhaps the goal of the game would be making sure that no one loses. How amazing would it be if all of us collectively and individually were working towards making sure that no one loses? That's what I need white folks to do. And students who have been rallying and protesting on campus throughout the 7 years that I've been at St. Ben's and St. John's, some are at different stages. As a matter of fact, all of them are at different stages in their journey to doing the work. What I've really enjoyed, though, is seeing students throughout the years who have committed to doing the work instead of just talking about it for the moment, because they're all caught up in their feelings. And I'm grateful for them. I'm grateful for our alumni and alumni who have done the work prior to me being here and while I've been here. So I want to continue students to be intentional about their educations, not just the stuff they're learning in their classrooms, but learning about life, learning about themselves, and learning about others.
I love that image of kind of co-creating the game where everyone wins, right? Or no one loses. And it does make me think about the fact that a college ought to be the perfect environment for that, because we're actually not about sort of seeing that, well, some people graduate and some don't. There's winners and losers. We want everybody to be educated. We want everybody to graduate. So it should be a part of our ethos and kind of even our understanding of the work that we do. Not that it always has been in the way that you're talking about, but there is something about this environment that should lend itself to kind of creating an environment where everybody wins, a game where everybody wins. That's great. You talked about the personal journeys of our students. And I think all of us, right? Not only our students are on at different points in our journeys. And I know as I think about my own, part of, for me, that journey was moving from sort of a mindset where I was really thinking, like, why can't we just be pro-diversity? You know, why do we have to be negative? We need to be pro-diversity. And part of what I've learned is that it's actually essential and important to claim an anti-racist stance in the world. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about why it's important to be anti-racist as well as pro-diversity.
Sure. You know, when I think about pro-diversity, that is really a recognition that we are all different.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, that's a given.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a space of wanting to appreciate and perhaps even celebrate those differences. It's great. However, there's no requirement to engage with that. It's just there.
Mm-hmm.
And community isn't just about proximity. It is about engagement, and it is about involvement and vulnerability and all of that. So pro-diversity is perhaps the bare minimum that we're looking for.
Right.
But there are a couple of things that have come to mind over the years that I've been working at St. Ben's and St. John's. One of them is I went to a training done by a chief diversity officer at one of the community colleges in Minneapolis. And he said, everybody's racist. He said, you just have to figure out what kind of racist you are. Okay, that was a little shocking. But in listening to him, I understood. True, we are all racist. Some of us are active racists. Some of us are passive racist. And some of us are anti-racist. And so being anti-racist isn't just about being non-racist, because non-racist is just not doing those bad things, not saying those bad things. Being anti-racist requires of us to engage in our communities, the structures, the systems that perpetuate racism, dismantle them. It's not enough that we don't want to be racist. We have to get to that space where we're actively doing what's necessary every single day to be anti-racist and pro-diversity, right, and multicultural. Mm-hmm. And in all honesty, I recognize that we're asking people to do extra work, extra psychic work, extra spiritual work, changing their language. Yep, exactly. And all of us are being asked to do that because although we're talking about systemic racism for right now, we could talk about systemic oppression and include the systemic sexism and systemic ableism and classism, et cetera. These systems are all interconnected. And when we're able to work collectively together, there's a greater hope and possibility for us to be successful.
What do you see? I'll ask Amanda this. Amanda, what do you see as the biggest obstacles to St. Ben's becoming an anti-racist community? I hope that we're on a journey there, but I also know that we're not there yet. And there are obstacles along the way. Talk about what you see there and maybe how we can address those.
Overcome the status quo. Right, and that status quo might be at this non-racist level, this celebration of diversity, but it calls for something more. It calls for something more transformational. It calls for something more radical to really create an anti-racist institution where we need to take a hard look at our policies and our practices and what we have come to see as the norm. It shakes us up a little bit. And some of us might be excited by that, right, but a lot of us might be really nervous about what that means.
So there's inertia and there's fear. That's all a part of that. Anna, what would you say are some of the obstacles toward truly becoming an anti-racist institution at St. Ben's?
I think the work of transformative inclusion is disturbing work because we're saying that we're willing for the very core of us to be disturbed. That right at the beginning is almost anti-institutional. I mean, I kind of hate to name that because it's a little scary, but that's true. If we're saying we could radically disrupt who we are at the core, well, there are some institutional things that a higher learning institution does. Are we saying we could disrupt those?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. In the work of this grant, yes, we are. That comes right down to capital. It comes down to money. It comes down to how we live. It comes down to how we express ourselves sexually and intimately. All these things, it's all there. So I'm a little shocked that we got to do this work at all, because it's so powerful that we were invited to do it by our president.
Yes.
Was career changing for me, and so really? I do. Yeah, for sure. Because I always felt we had her blessing to make trouble if that's what it takes. That's all for now.
Mary Hinton, President Hinton has been just obviously such a champion for all of this. And I think this is kind of back to that idea of the Benedictine value of hospitality. One of the ways I've seen it play out at St. Ben's is the way I think President Hinton has led in creating an environment that welcomes protest, for example. So we often see student protests happening at the St. Ben's campus, and she is there, and we and the cabinet are always there listening and learning and responding to. I'll always remember very early on in my tenure at St. Ben's, there was a student protest happening over at Gretzky. And Mary said, let's go, we're all going to go over and walk. So all of us in cabinet did. And we actually served cocoa and cookies to all of the protesters. And I just thought that was real. That was very Mary Hinton, for one thing. And it was also this sense that we don't just tolerate protest or dissent or questions, but that we welcome it and we receive it. And there's ways that it makes us better people, a better community. So
we feed it. We actually feed it.
We literally feed it with cocoa and cookies. It was a very cold winter day, as I recall.
I remember.
So how have you seen that? The rest of you kind of being lived out, I guess, in the community in terms of, trying to welcome those questions and that dissent, because it isn't easy. And our students have been, faculty and staff as well, but I really look at our students as ones who have raised really challenging questions. And I think we work hard, maybe not always successfully, to hear that. How do you see it playing out in your own work or in your teaching, in your work with students?
With me, I've seen it play out very specifically with students, because instead of dismissing me as the administration and wanting me to defend our actions or lacks thereof, I've seen students actually step in and correct students and let other students know what's actually happening on campus. Because obviously students are getting millions of points of information every day. So they may not be reading emails or may not be reading the latest issue of the Alumnae magazine. But I've seen students actually say, no, let me tell you actually what's been happening. So for example, a few years, I think it was in 2017, some students made a list of demands, very similar to what happened in Mizzou. And I recently looked at the list, and almost everything on that list has been addressed, courtesy and with very much support from President Hinton. But almost everything had been addressed on that list. To me, that's outstanding leadership. But here's what I'd like to bring to the forefront is it was the students who brought it to us. It was the students who helped us make this work. And it was the students who were telling other students, yes, we're not there yet, but look at what we've done. When it comes from the students, it sounds differently than from us, because if we say it, it sounds like an excuse. But when students say it, it sounds hopeful. So even the fact that we had MLK Day off this past year or this past January was a first. And that was because students protested.
Very directly. It was a
Exactly.
student protest that immediately led to that change. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's good. Anna or Amanda, how do you see it in the classroom, when you're teaching? How do you see those student voices being used, I guess?
In the classroom, we talk about what happens outside of the classroom. Okay. So the power of collective voice, the power of collective action. We see this playing out in the streets of Minneapolis, right? Mm-hmm. That to bring attention, to galvanize attention so that the powers that be will then change, do the boring work, the committee work to change policy, to draft things. Our students are able to see that in action. It is enormously, enormously powerful. Mm-hmm. And the more we can, what's more Benedictine than collective action?
That's right. Good. Anna, anything you'd agree with that? You see it all the time.
I would agree with it. We can keep going.
Okay. All right. Well, it actually does. I want to circle back to something that we talked about earlier, and that was mentioning COVID-19, the pandemic. And I think it's important to remember all of this is happening in the midst of a pandemic. And I wonder if you see any ways that COVID-19 and this work of transformative inclusion, are connected or speak to one another or have intersectionality of some kind. I'd love to hear what any of the three of you think about that.
I'll go ahead, Anna, if you're okay with that, and share just my thought, which is transformative inclusion challenges us, every single one of us, to make this work personal. Mm-hmm. and to not sit on the sidelines. And in the same way, I would argue that COVID-19 has done that for the entire world. Whether you're a person who believes it's real and extremely dangerous, or someone who believes it's just a hoax made up to get folks to have vaccines. Mm-hmm. Regardless of where you stand on that spectrum, you have been impacted by COVID-19, mm-hmm. just as we should all be impacted by doing the work of transformative inclusion. This isn't something that just some people do and some people benefit from. COVID-19 and how we as a society or as humanity are trying to wrestle with and deal with it requires all of us to know a little bit more than we did 3 months ago, and requires all of us to be intentional about, I'm going to get on the train of trying to protect myself, my family, and the community. Or conversely, for those folks who think, I'm still going to go about life as usual. But you can't not see it. You cannot ignore it because it impacts all of us. And what I'm hoping is that, like COVID-19 and transformative inclusion, that we'll get to a point where we are all healthier because we are all working together.
COVID-19 has clearly, I think, laid bare real inequities in our health system and the impact on communities of color. And also, I would say, lower income folks and people in rural areas in some cases as well. So it becomes a lens through which we can understand how generations of racial oppression have resulted in very real, right. Objective, like physical hurt, for certain communities. Amanda, I know you've thought some about this, about how the pandemic and this work intersects. What have you been thinking about it?
I think we've talked about this in terms of decision making, and we think about institutional leadership, mm-hmm. because we need to think about who is this disproportionately affecting. We know that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting the Black community, mm-hmm. Indigenous folks, other people of color, and certainly people in poverty. Mm-hmm. We know that is happening. We know that that's also true of the other pandemic, racism and police brutality. Right. And I might add climate change. Okay. And so as we are, as a community, reacting in crisis, we need to pay attention to who has a place at the table, who is included in the decision making, who are we centering, right? Are there certain people that are not being attended to? Are there certain people who will suffer more if we make this decision versus that decision about online classes versus living in the dorms, right? We really need to be mindful, because if we don't do it in a crisis, I think we're revealing what our priorities really are.
Well, we saw it clearly when our students had to go home suddenly this spring. And so the fact that actually many of the alums who are probably listening today and our donors really responded with a great deal of generosity, so that we could make sure that students who they can't come up with $500 for a plane ticket home, or need a place to store their materials or whatever. It's really important. I want to make sure we've got time for questions from the audience, but I want to ask, two actually questions before we turn it over to them. So this is really kind of coming back to our work at St. Ben's. And as we've all mentioned, I think during the course of this conversation, how grateful that we've been for the leadership of President Hinton over these past 6 years. And she really has been a champion of this work, and I think has pushed us in such important ways over this time. I'd like to hear from each one of you actually about how your work with the Becoming Community initiative, what that suggests about who and what is needed in our next single joint president. It's a big change for us. What have you learned about what's required, I think, in that president?
I can go. I'll keep it brief. President Hinton used to say something, and I want our next president to say this too. She used to say that inclusion is the mission. It's not in addition to the mission. It's not alongside the mission. That inclusion is the mission. And that is something we need from our next joint president.
Anna, what do you think?
One of my favorite memories of Mary Hinton addressing the college was on an occasion when she lifted up the work of a member of our custodial staff at St. Ben's, who was the person who noticed that an incoming student on move-in day had no one to help her move in. It was this member of the custodial staff who saw that student, who realized that that student was trying to do this work alone, and greeted that student, helped that student, but assured the student of a warm welcome, and that they weren't going to be alone while they were here at St. Ben's. I want a president who notices every member of our community and does not look to a certain organizational hierarchy chart to decide who's most important or who gives the best welcome. That's what I'd like to see.
Thanks, Anna. Brandyn. Wow.
That I love working with you colleagues. I am thinking very specifically about a president who wants St. Ben's and St. John's to become anti-racist multicultural institutions. I'm thinking of a president who, and I'd appreciate a president who has a strong desire for environmental justice. And I mean that in all the ways we talk about the environment, sustainability, environment, social, economics, etc. And I would love to have a president who is 100% on board with doing the work of ending gendered violence, especially as it manifests itself in sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, etc. I know I'm asking a lot, but we are trying to graduate students from our institutions who will go out and change the world, make it a better place, bring Benedictine values to life in the communities in which they're living, serving, working, etc. So if we could have someone who is really passionate and serious about centering all of those things, it would be phenomenal.
Thank you, Brandyn, and thank you, Amanda and Anna, for that insight. This is going to be a very important year in the life of our college, both institutions, obviously, and I think keeping this front and center during this time as we move toward a single president is critically important. I've got one quick little question for each of you before we go, because we asked this of everybody who is a part of our series here. A question for each of you is Benny bars or chocolate lava cake?
I'm gonna go with, I've never had chocolate lava cake, so I'm necessarily gonna go with Benny bars.
Okay. We'll introduce you to chocolate lava cake soon.
I'm looking forward to it.
Amanda, where do you come down on that burning question?
Benny bars all the way.
Benny bars all the way. Anna?
I'm gluten-free.
Okay. Okay, thanks to all three of you for this. Let's turn it over to the audience for questions. Amy, do we have any questions that have been submitted?
Yes, we've had a lot. So I just want to say we're going to do our best to get to as many questions as we can in the allotted time. So thank you all for submitting so many questions this evening. The first question I have is how has these programmatic efforts assisted in shifting the racist campus culture of CSB SJU? And second part of that is how have these programmatic efforts assisted, sorry, that's the same question. So it must have been duplicated. So how have the programmatic efforts assisted in shifting the racist campus culture of CSB SJU?
Mm-hmm. I'll go ahead and tackle that one. One of the things that comes to mind is we are moving towards restorative justice as our foundation for being in community. It's a little different than a punitive or criminal justice system. That's relevant because part of the Mellon grant and Becoming Community, we were able to bring in Dr. David Karp, who is well known internationally for his work with restorative justice. We are in the process of revising our human rights policy so that it centers restorative justice. That is also something that has come as a direct result of the protests the list of demands from 2017. And unfortunately, there have been far too many students who have gone through our old process who haven't found the healing or the reconciliation or the belongingness, honestly, that we aspire to be. So I'm looking forward to that. So that's just one thing that immediately came to mind.
Amanda or Anna?
I think this goes back to something Brandyn said earlier, is that we need to be able to name it, that there is a racist campus climate. And being able to see that, being able to name it and being able to do something about it is our work. And so this grant really began with a focus on faculty and staff. And so we did a lot of professional development because what we heard from students were about microaggressions and the things that hurt, and we required restorative justice in the classroom. And I think we have seen a shift there. We saw hundreds of faculty and staff participate not just in one workshop, but in sustained efforts, really, really engaging again and again in hard work and applying that in their courses. And then more recently, when we started the dialogue groups, what we also hear from students is that it's not always the faculty and staff. Sometimes it's the other students who are the ones that make you feel like you don't belong and hurt you. And so I think with the dialogue groups, we're really engaging people in some deep learning about many dimensions of inclusion. And that's how it works. It's a long road. You work at it and you work at it, but what's happening here is collective action. We have huge numbers of people working at this together. So you have a big cohort of movement, and that makes me hopeful.
One of the changes I've seen that we've implemented in the last few years has been the introduction of a search advocate to all of our hiring processes to identify and correct instances of implicit bias, basically, in the search process. And I think it's been, at least from my conversations with others, it's been more effective actually with our faculty. And so we've brought on some of our, certainly more diverse groups of faculty hires in the past. I also think it's been frankly less successful with staff for whatever reasons, but I know that it's made something of a difference, I think, in our faculty searches. Amy, do we have other questions?
Absolutely. Can you share a story from your work with the Becoming Community initiative that inspires you and keeps you going?
I'll share one. A couple years ago, time is just weird now. I think it was a couple years ago. We brought in Dr. Liam Lair, who was in our community for a very brief but amazing time. And while he visited with us, he was talking about pronoun usage. He was talking about all gender restrooms, etc. What I've noticed since his visit are the number of all gender restrooms that we have on campus have increased, as well as the number of faculty and staff at every level who have started putting their pronouns in their email signatures. That excites me. That because it was, quote, relatively simple, but people responded to, you know what, I think it's important. And so here we are.
Great. Anna, and a story that inspires you in this work?
Mine comes from the time of the pandemic. I've been on social media so much more than I was before the pandemic, and I'm trying to monitor that and notice if I'm on there too much, but I'm not with people physically. And so the social media has been a way that I've been connecting. And one day I was on there scrolling through on the Facebook, and a colleague who has been a member of one of our dialogue groups had posted as her picture on her feed, look what I got in the mail from my dialogue group co-facilitator today. And the dialogue group co-facilitator had sent out an inspiring sort of badge to everybody, sent them to their homes, that was related to the structural work they had been doing in their group. And I thought, look at how people are still doing the work of community and taking care of each other, even across a physical distance. And that just made me feel like this work was really worthy and it was still ongoing.
Thank you for that. Amanda.
The three of us were talking about this earlier today because my favorite story is about Brandyn Woodard, because about a year ago, Brandyn and Anna went to a conference in the Twin Cities to present on Becoming Community, and Brandyn came back and he told me, he said, I was doing the presentation and I said in the presentation that I think we're really making a difference, and then I realized I meant it, and that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
That's great. Amy, do we have other questions?
Yes. One question is, as a student at the time, I remember the list of demands being made and some engagement from administration and the campus presidents. I'm wondering what else came of that, or if that had a role in this work of addressing issues on campus.
Yeah, we've actually gone back very explicitly to that list of demands and compared it to the kinds of initiatives we're doing. And when Brandyn said that when we go back and we see that we really have made almost all of those changes or are working towards those changes, we mean it. But the interesting thing that I want alum to know is that just last year, the faculty voted in a new common curriculum. And I know for a fact that the folks on that steering committee took that list of demands and used it as they were designing aspects of this new curriculum. I don't know if everyone knows this, but now all new students are required to take 2 courses, and one of them is in your very first year. They're called Culture and Social Difference courses. And the first one is focused on identity. And the second one that you have to take before you graduate is focused on social systems, particularly around race and gender. These are the kinds of things that students have been calling for and demanding for good reason, and people have listened. And it has become literal structural changes, like real requirements for every single body who comes to our schools now.
That's terrific.
And again, when people speak, when people collectively come together, change can happen. Again, we're seeing this on the streets of Minneapolis, and we've seen this on our campuses. It is exciting.
That's great. Brandyn or Anna, would you add anything more about the list of demands and how you see them actually being addressed today? Good. We've spoken to some of those, but thank you. Thank you for that. Amy, how are we doing on time?
I think we have several minutes left here, Cathy. This one's a larger question. I have two that I'm really hoping that we can get to here yet. So I'm gonna go with the shorter one. Well, we'll see if it's shorter for you guys to answer or not, but I'm gonna go with this one first. I think part of what could make CSB SJU troubled from trying to institutionally change from just being pro-diversity to anti-racist is the alumni. For this reason, what will St. Ben's and St. John's response be when receiving this kind of notion from them?
Wow.
One of let me start, if you don't mind, as someone who works with our alumni and with our donors. I think it's an excellent point. One of the things we're trying to do is things like this, right? To bring together programming that can engage our alums in really challenging and difficult questions. I think it's also, I bring it back to mission when I talk to alums and donors. And I think Amanda, you made the point that the mission is inclusion, that's something that Mary Hinton stood for. I think about our vision statement for our Bennies, and that's that we educate women to think critically, lead courageously, advocate passionately. Well, if you're leading courageously and advocating passionately in the world in support of anti-racism, that's what St. Ben's is all about. And we see so many of our alums using their voices and taking action in ways like that. So I think it's important to kind of address those issues with our alums by really coming back to who we are and what our mission is right now and the work that we're doing and trying to always get better at in terms of how we educate our women to actually, like Brandyn said, change the world, right? That's what we're all about. And I think that most of our alumni are excited about that and can get on board. And I hope that others can kind of come along with that, though it may be challenging.
I would like to drop in one thing that we did not mention at the beginning. Amanda is an alumna.
Mm-hmm.
This is a version of what it looks like to do the work, to be a lifelong learner, to give back to the community, but also to broaden it out. So I'm appreciative of Amanda. I'm appreciative of all of our colleagues, especially our alums, who are actually doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think this question should be a call to action to all of us who are alum. If we are afraid that there are other alum who are going to get in the way of creating a better, more just future, then we alum need to be the noisy ones who speak up and cause a fuss and write the letters and give the money. I mean, this is us.
That's great. And I know there's action right now on social media with petitions and calls for action on the part of St. Ben's. And actually, we welcome all of you as allies in this work to help create an inclusive atmosphere that's truly transformative on our campuses. So I think we can work together. We're already looking at fundraising that we can be about that provides support for marginalized people, young women at St. Ben's. In our last campaign, actually, we raised quite a bit of money. In fact, most of the money that we raised was actually for scholarships and sort of fellowships for experiential learning that's directed toward young women who, may be the first in their families to attend college or who come from low income, perhaps Pell Grant eligible families. And so giving them access, not just to scholarships, which are important, but even to make sure they've got money so they can do the research, or, you know, can afford to take an unpaid internship, or can afford to study abroad. That's what we're raising money for. And I think that's part, because you're right, it takes money to do this. And you know, we need to be doing more of that. So. Amy, any more questions?
Cathy, I think we are actually up on our time, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. I know there were more questions that we weren't able to get to. I want to thank Brandyn, Amanda, and Anna for taking time tonight for this really important conversation. We are very grateful for you. I want to thank you in the audience for taking time for this conversation. Please, this, as Amy will share, this is going to be recorded and available on the website. Please share this with your friends, because we think more of our alums and donors and other friends need to hear this conversation. As we log off, please stay on so that Amy can share with you information about tonight's episode and upcoming episodes of the St. Ben's at Home series. Thank you.
Cathy.
Thank you again to the Becoming Community team and Cathy for your time this evening. Audience, you can find additional resources on anti-racism by visiting the library's virtual book display, as well as learn more about the Becoming Community initiative by going to the links listed here. These links will also be included in the evaluation form that will be emailed to you by the Alumnae Relations team. This is where you can also share additional questions or comments on tonight's episode. The upcoming episode in our St. Ben's at Home series will be held next Wednesday, June 17th at 7 p.m. and it'll be featuring Nate Daney, Vice President of Enrollment Management and Marketing. We hope that you will join us, and please invite your Benny friends. You can find additional details about St. Ben's at Home series on csbalumni.com/events page. Thank you again for your participation tonight and for all of your wonderful questions. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.